Order. Welcome to meeting number 32 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. The committee is meeting today to continue our review on the House of Commons virtual hybrid proceedings provisions pursuant to the House Order of June 23, 2022. Our first panel consists of academic witnesses, followed by a second panel focusing on the issue of language interpretation in virtual House and committee proceedings. Before we start, a reminder that all comments made by members and witnesses should be addressed through the chair. And we will start with opening comments. Well, I should first welcome, we've got Dr. Kathy PROC, Professor and Senior Fellow, School of Policy Studies and Department of Political Studies, Queen's University. Dr. Jonathan Malloy, Professor, Bell Chair in Canadian Parliamentary Democracy, Department of Political Science, Carleton University. We have Dr. Erica Raymond, Assistant Professor, Department of Political Science, University of Calgary, and Dr. Melanie Thomas, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, University of Calgary as well. Opening comments, we'll start with Dr. PROC. Welcome to PROC.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's wonderful to be speaking before you and appearing today. I decided to walk my talk, and that's why I'm appearing in person. So, Parliament is the beating heart of democracy. You know that. It is tremendously demanding of you, but it also gives tremendously to you. And I think while you have to be commended for how Parliament functioned during the pandemic, now those measures must come to a conclusion. I'm going to explain why I believe that in terms of the functions that Parliament performs in our democratic system. Policy-making function consists of two roles, a support role to get the government's legislative agenda through, and an accountability role. And both were affected during the pandemic. One study of 80 parliamentary democracies has shown that consultations with the public and public engagement generally was not at its maximum. In fact, it suffered greatly. Secondly, in the support function, there's an importance of being in person and building those relations across the parties, but also within parties. And to have a caucus that is in person allows for more frank feedback than online, particularly if people are worried about being recorded. Accountability also suffered when you don't have face-to-face, when the Prime Minister and members of Cabinet are not forced to stand up and face the opposition, you lose something. When they must stand up in Parliament and speak to the opposition, they're probably going to have given policies a little bit more thought because they're going to have to justify them. There are subtle checks built into Parliament that we lose when people are not in face-to-face meetings. The representational function of the House of Commons is very important. First of all, electoral conversion. It is the House of Commons that converts the results of votes into government and opposition parties, and it's important to have that visual image to Canadians. That is somewhat diminished when you go into a hybrid format. Also, politicians come to Ottawa to represent their constituencies and to do the national business, but it's by understanding constituent interests within the national interest that they learn to moderate, to temper views, and to build better, more inclusive policy across the country, I believe. When you stay in your constituency, there's a tendency for what we call policy capture to set in, where you may be influenced by local interests too strongly and not have that tempering effect of the national interest. And there are system maintenance functions that Parliament performs, recruitment. It's by bringing people together that you recruit the people who are going to be the great public servants, whether elected or before they're elected or after they're elected. If they're in Parliament and they're interacting face-to-face, they're going to build political acuity and the skills that they need to perform those functions even better. Secondly, Parliament integrates. It builds the bridges. People come from across the country and learn about other parts of the country by listening to their colleagues. And that creates a certain harmony. There's a socialization function, and this replies to the arguments on diversity and not requiring people to be in Parliament, but saying that for particular demographic personal characteristics, they need to be online. If people are not here in person, Parliament is not forced to change. And a good example of that is when there was a member of the Ontario legislature who was hearing impaired. They realized that the bells to call people to vote did not work, and that's when they installed lights. That is just one example, but there are many more I could go into, including washrooms. They changed when women came into Parliament, but we won't go into that. And finally, there's a legitimation function. Parliament not only must work, it must be seen to work for Canadians to understand what government does and why it's important. It's when the legislature is in operation, when there's accountability, that you get transparency of policies and government is seen to work better and people believe their views are being heard. Now, in my recommendations, which I include in the brief that I know you have, I do mention that hybrid format would be good for committees, I believe. It could be used there. I think it should be investigated because you can get more witnesses through that. But otherwise, I think Parliament should be sitting in person. And I'll stop there with just to say Parliament works when it's seen to work, and that's a healthy democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. PROC. We will now go with opening comments, remarks from Dr. Malloy.
Thank you very much. All right.
I just want to say it was a long time ago that I first met Mr. Jonathan Malloy. Partly. He was my advisor in graduate school. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention, and I know this might mean something to the member, but in 1996, he wrote a seminal piece in Canadian Public Administration on reconciling expectations and reality in House of Commons committees. And when I was thinking about his appearance here today, I just thought I would raise that seminal work that he wrote and in committee, in good faith. Okay. And
can we just thank you, honestly. We try to run a functional professional committee meeting here, and I'm going to try to maintain that today. So I thank you for bringing up something. I'm not sure why it's relevant, but maybe we'll find out later.
Expectations and reality.
With that, Dr. Malloy, opening comments to you. I apologize for that introduction.
We'll give him an A+ for effort there. Thank you. So, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. So, my name is Jonathan Malloy. I'm a professor of political science at Carleton University, as was said, where I hold the Bell Chair in Canadian Parliamentary Democracy. I'm also president of the former president of the Canadian Study of Parliament Group, although I speak only for myself today. I appreciate the chance to speak on hybrid proceedings. I will immediately begin by noting I have not conducted any primary data gathering myself on this topic. I haven't crunched numbers or anything like that. But I have published reflections on the matter, and I've thought a great deal about the overall issue in the context of Parliament and its purpose. I do not advocate either for or against hybrid proceedings. Instead, I offer a challenge. Discussions about hybrid proceedings cannot be separated from the larger context of the institution itself. And so the hybrid issue is an important test of the maturity of the Parliament of Canada, and in this case specifically, the House of Commons. My mentor at C.E.S. Franks of Queen's University once wrote that the reform of Parliament is not merely a technical matter of making Parliament more effective and efficient, although it's often presented in those terms. Reform is also a question of the purposes for which political power is to be used in Canada, and how various interests and viewpoints succeed or fail to influence political choices and outcomes. I hold similar views. The apparent lack of long-term consensus in this House of Commons about hybrid proceedings betrays a larger weakness and immaturity of the institution. Hybrid proceedings are far beyond a technical matter. They are rooted, as Frank wrote, in how various interests and viewpoints succeed or fail to influence political choices and outcomes. Despite its age, and I speak with respect for the committee here today, the Parliament of Canada often acts as an immature institution, not able to stand up for itself and its own interests beyond partisanship, especially compared to its closest counterparts. The most vivid illustration is the repeated abuse of prorogation by Canadian governments on short notice to escape difficult political circumstances. Both the previous two governments and the current one have done so, the last despite its election promise to refrain from the practice. In comparison, Australia and New Zealand have largely discarded the practice of prorogation entirely, and in 2019 the UK government tried and failed to prorogue Parliament to get out of the sticky situation, this being seen as an unacceptable violation of the institution's norms and integrity for mere partisan purposes. We see this institutional immaturity in other ways, such as the comparative weakness of the Commons Speaker compared to the British counterpart. I thus unhappily view the apparent current lack of a long-term consensus in hybrid proceedings to be another illustration of the adolescent immaturity of the Canadian Parliament. There are obvious arguments for and against, both for and against, hybrid proceedings, which this committee will be well familiar with, many of them not substantially different from discussions in any workplace in 2022. I need not review them in detail. Obviously, remote participation provides certain conveniences and can facilitate better access and reduce inequities, but also means less opportunity for informal interaction in building and maintaining an institutional culture that goes beyond the screen. These are trade-offs which we are all wrestling these days in various organizations. But more unique and distinct to Parliament is the dimension of partisanship and partisan interests as it pertains to hybrid proceedings, and this is what concerns me. The institution is approaching hybrid proceedings in the same way in which far too much of the institution is run, by short-term interests and whatever suits the side of the House one happens to be sitting on. I do want to recognize the progress made over the last 2 years, and I recognize there are momentous complexities here. But regardless, the lack of a long-term consensus on a hybrid House is concerning and does not reflect well on the institution and its maturity. Again, I do not firmly advocate a particular solution here. What I do advocate is consensus, which requires give and take from all sides and going beyond immediate interest. And I do realize parliamentarians are often given vague advice along these lines to work together better. Nevertheless, this is my advice, and I repeat my opening challenge, that the hybrid issue is an important test of the maturity of the Parliament of Canada, in this case specifically of the House of Commons. The institution needs to get this right to show Canadians that Parliament can stand up for itself as an institution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Malloy. Now, we will have Dr. Thomas and Dr. Raymond sharing their opening time. So I will pass the screen over to you, Dr. Thomas, and then you can just pass straight to Dr. Raymond. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Dr. Melanie Thomas, and I'll be sharing my time today with Dr. Raymond. We join you from Calgary, Alberta in Treaty 7 territory. We focus on a key question. Does maintaining hybridity help or hinder Parliament in its fulfilling its core functions of representation and accountability? For us, hybridity can clearly help Parliament fulfill these two functions. What is crucial is its design. If designed well, hybridity is a relatively straightforward fix for several systemic barriers in Canadian politics. It's not a panacea, but it undeniably could help. Given this, for us, the bar to reject adopting a permanent hybrid option in Parliament is very, very high. We highlight two considerations: how a hybrid option helps facilitate representation and accountability, and then results from research Dr. Raymond is working on about support among members of Parliament for hybrid proceedings. On that first core function of representation, there's no question that continuing with a hybrid option improves Parliament's ability to operate as a representative institution. Hybridity improves this in terms of both who gets elected to Parliament and in terms of who is able to participate in parliamentary debate. Allowing MPs the option to participate in remote proceedings when they need to has the potential to shift who considers running for and serving in public office, notably for Canadians with caregiving and other constraints. Folks with parenting responsibilities, elder care responsibilities, people with illnesses or disabilities might look at the prospect of a regular commute to Ottawa and think, absolutely not, I can't swing that. And so they would self-select out of elected office. And we know from decades of research that this is disproportionately women who are systematically selecting out. When it comes to parliamentary debate, providing the option to participate remotely ensures that members of parliament voices are heard and their constituents can be represented even when the MP is unable to be physically present in Ottawa due to illness, caregiving responsibilities, or whatever else might arise. Hybridity will not remove all of the systemic barriers that women, Indigenous people, racialized people, and people with disabilities face with respect to a career in elected public office, but providing the option sends an important signal about who Parliament is designed for and who is welcome within the institution. On accountability, when we speak of this, we mean parliamentarians' ability to learn, follow up on, scrutinize, and accept or reject what the government is doing. For us, hybrid and remote proceedings could improve accountability in Parliament for similar reasons for why it improves representation. Hybridity ensures more MPs can participate in the processes Parliament uses to hold government to account. The key question is design, not mode. While it is not a panacea, we see great potential for hybrid proceedings to be designed in a way to enhance Parliament's accountability functions.
Great. So I'm just going to add a few additional considerations to supplement Dr. Thomas's remarks about hybridity and core parliamentary functions. So first, I want to speak very briefly about the downstream impacts of a more inclusive parliament, and then I'd also like to share insights from some new research about MPs' attitudes towards hybridity. So first, I just want to draw out more explicitly why it matters that hybridity can help to make Parliament more inclusive and representative, as Dr. Thomas has just highlighted. And there are lots of good reasons to care about whether Parliament is diverse and inclusive, but what I want to emphasize is that diversity in terms of who serves in Parliament has an impact on the substantive issues that get addressed in politics. So research repeatedly demonstrates that who a representative is and how they experience the world shapes the issues and the positions that they will bring forward in political debate. So my own research confirms that in parliamentary debate in Canada, women MPs are dramatically more likely than men, regardless of party affiliation, to put women's issues on the political agenda and to bring women's perspectives into the parliamentary conversation. So having in place measures that make Parliament more inclusive, like hybridity, helps to ensure that we're not missing the perspectives of the folks who might otherwise be systematically excluded from participating in Parliament. The second thing I want to highlight is that there is actually a very high level of support among MPs for the continuation of at least some aspects of the hybrid parliamentary model. So as part of a larger research project looking at the family friendliness of parliamentary institutions, my colleague at the University of Calgary, Susan Franciscat, and I surveyed MPs this past summer about their attitudes towards various measures that could be implemented to make it easier for parliamentarians to reconcile political and family life. So we're still in the very early stages of this project. We haven't run any kind of detailed analyses or published our results, but there are some top line findings that I am able to share that I think are important for the conversation that we're having here today. So first is that there is an overwhelming level of support among MPs.
I have Dr. Raymond.
Yes.
We're at our time. So I know, but we're going to get you good questions and make sure that you can share that insight, and you can always submit it to the committee as well through the clerk. Okay,
great, thank you.
We're going to do first round of questions, and we're starting with Mr. Viss, followed by Mr. Turnbull, followed by Madame Goudreau, and then Mrs. Blaney. Mr. Viss.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses today. I was very much looking forward to this panel today. Upon hearing the testimony, I think I'm going to direct my first questions to either Dr. Thomas or Raymond. And you talked about inclusivity of Parliament. First, let me preface that I am a father of 2 children and a baby on the way. It is extremely challenging being from BC. And doing my parliamentary functions from time to time, and that is what I signed up for. And I know some of my female colleagues that have spoken here today talked about the same challenges in our last session. But you talked about hybridity as a way to improve participation. I would actually argue that it's the opposite. And since I was elected in 2019, the government has adopted a practice which has effectively hoarded speaking times to 2 members. That's Kevin Lamoureux and Mark Gerritsen. And the government doesn't actually let backbench Liberal members speak on a regular basis. And it's either because the House leader doesn't want them to speak, or there is, well, it's participation during government orders during a hybrid parliament. And I can cite the data from the Parliament of Canada.
Point of order. On the basis of relevance, I don't see the relevance of this line of questioning. Obviously, Mr. Viss has lots of latitude to come to that conclusion, but I'll also say that it's just it's untrue what he's saying, which is that that the government doesn't allow other members to speak in the House of Commons. That's patently false.
Well, you didn't let me either finish
I'm
it.
just going to, and you get to finish because the floor is going to come back to you, rest assured. I'm just going to remind us all that we have an understanding as to the work we're doing as a committee, and we have chosen this study, and it's important. And I think we have an approach we can take, which is to define someone else or to define kind of where we're at. So perhaps this is where Mr. Viss is going, I'm not sure. But I think we can actually have a really good conversation here and get our parliament to the spot that it should be. And I think that colleagues are expecting this, and I think Canadians are expecting this. So I'm going to pass the floor to you, Mr. Viss, and I think you have a choice how to use your time, and I have confidence you will use it in a good way.
Mr. Turnbull and I have actually both spoken in Parliament about 72 times. Maybe I'm a bit more after last night. I've had, during government orders, I've intervened about 75 times. Mr. Turnbull, according to the Parliament of Canada, is about 72. Mr. Lamoureux is 780. The only person to exceed him is the Deputy Speaker, Carol Hughes. After Mr. Lamoureux, it's Alexandra Mendez, the other Deputy Speaker, followed by Chris D'Entremont, and then Mr. Gerritsen, who has intervened, according to my numbers here, 527 times. There's also a list of parliamentarians. There's about 20 of them, 2 Conservative, about 18 Liberals, if I remember correctly, who have not intervened once during government orders. So if the purpose of hybrid parliament is to improve inclusivity, why are 2 members more or less taking up all of the speaking times during the core function of holding the government to account during government orders?
So I don't know if you would like us to answer at this point, but I'm happy to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Raymond, because we do have an answer, I think, to the question that's implied.
Please, either would be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think sort of the first point is really just that the sort of the allocation of speaking time is a separate issue from the sort of the mode through which parliamentarians engage in parliamentary debate, right? And so I think my inclination would be to sort of put the question of sort of how is speaking time allocated as a kind of separate problem from hybridity, right? That sort of assuming you can sort of resolve that how speaking time gets allocated issue, then if you have the option of hybridity on the table, then that sort of provides more opportunities for a wider range of folks to consider running for public office and then serving in public office, right? And that we know.
The problem is that when people are here, they don't actually get to do their job, and it's only gotten worse under a hybrid model. As Dr. PROC outlined, it matters the type of functionality that we have. We have to be seen to work, and I just don't see under the hybrid model that people are able to participate in the way they want.
So I'm wondering.
Please go ahead.
I'm wondering if you could perhaps connect the dots a little bit more clearly there about how is it that hybridity exacerbates the problem of sort of how speaking time is allocated, right?
I believe that under the hybrid system, there have been practices adopted which have limited the members' ability to participate in Parliament itself. That because they're behind a screen, they don't feel that they can stand up and speak on behalf of their constituents in the same way that maybe if they were in Ottawa a little more. And that is a very problematic approach to running democracy and holding a government to account.
So if I could intervene on that one, that's why we say the question is a problem of design and not mode, because we can come up with numerous examples about various caucus practices that do the same thing. in person. This is the well-established literature on the power of leader appointments. And so people don't want to speak out against their party leader in caucus, for example. This is why the norms about party discipline in Canadian politics being much, much stronger in our system than, say, the United Kingdom and any other examples of parliament. At the risk of being a bit blunt, what you're describing is a problem, and it's a problem with other parts of the system. And I would say that this is what my colleague has described as institutional immaturity. This is a problem of design, but it is not a problem of the mode with which Parliament chooses to do its work. And so this is why we have a very strict boundary between, is there a bigger issue with the institution, or is this about mode? And this isn't about
Thank you, Dr.
what
Thomas.
you're talking about.
Dr. Brock, you mentioned in your recommendations that parties need to revisit speaker lists and restore speaker choice. Has hybrid parliament exacerbated this problem?
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Viss. I don't know why I want to call you Dr. Viss today, but okay. Thank you, Mr. Viss. 6 minutes to you, Mr. Turnbull.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. I will certainly try to take up Dr. Malloy's challenge and try to reach consensus within these conversations. This study is extremely important. And, I would like to start with Dr. Raymond and Dr. Thomas as well. But Dr. Raymond, I wanted to give you the opportunity to cover those top-line findings, because I find it very interesting in terms of research that you've done and what the conclusions that have drawn or that you've been able to glean from that research. So could you fill us in on those findings?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate it. So the first kind of top line finding is that there is actually overwhelming support among MPs to continue to allow remote voting. So 79% of respondents either somewhat or strongly agreed that members on parental leave should be able to vote remotely. And that was the highest of all of the sort of questions that we asked about. That was the highest level of support on any of the issues. So continuing to allow remote voting, there's a high degree of support for that. The second relevant finding is that unprompted, quite a few of the respondents indicated that they supported the continuation of hybrid parliamentary proceedings. So in the survey, we included an open-ended question asking if there were other measures that should be considered to make Parliament more family-friendly. And more than a third of the folks who provided a response in that field said that making the hybrid option permanent was an important tool that would help MPs to balance work and family commitments. And then the last piece that I want to highlight that I think is relevant to our considerations here is that women MPs were significantly more likely than men to say that it's very difficult to be both a good parent and a good politician. So women MPs are reporting having a harder time reconciling parenthood and political life. So essentially what this does is it provides us with additional confirmation that keeping a hybrid option will actually help to make it easier for women in particular to serve in Parliament, since women who are parents, more so than men who are parents, do appear to be experiencing that barrier to participation more acutely. So those are kind of like the very top line findings that I think are sort of relevant to what we're thinking about here today.
Thank you very much for filling us in on those. I appreciate that. And I note that in a recent article that you two wrote together, which is great, I really found compelling. And I'll quote you, "We must not lose sight of the ways in which remote participation can make Parliament more democratic by making it more inclusive, equitable, and accountable." I thought that was a very compelling statement. I think you've covered a lot of that in your remarks today. I wanted to hone in a little bit more on accountability, because we often hear, and I'm constantly listening to both sides of the debates that we have on this topic. I was a member of PROC when we did the initial work during the pandemic on developing the hybrid provisions, and there was often, and opposition parties rightfully need to be able to hold the government to account, which I totally get. I think you two have said in that article that hybrid doesn't necessarily preclude opposition parties from holding the government to account. Can you speak to that a little bit more and give us your reasons why? Maybe I'll start with Dr. Thomas.
The thing I would repeat is that this is a question of design, not mode. And so at the risk of being a bit salty if the thing that makes committee work better by allowing witnesses like us to be able to appear remotely. The same principles would hold for members of parliament on this one. And so I feel like you can't really bifurcate those two things. If it's good for witnesses to appear remotely, then I struggle to see how the same considerations for that wouldn't appear for other parts of parliamentary work. And again, I just keep coming back to this idea of it's a question of design and how the institutional design gets built into how this work happens. And mode, there's once you push on that, it's difficult to see how the mode with which that actually happens ends up being the crux. Dr. Raymond might have other comments on that. I'm not sure, but.
I think the only thing that I would add is that sort of it to sort of build on what Dr. Thomas has said is that it's sort of the mode through which you're sort of questioning a cabinet minister or investigating a piece of legislation or whatever it might be, whether that's happening through a Zoom meeting or in person is sort of neither here nor there, so long as there is the actual opportunity to sort of press on those things and to dig into them and so on, right? And that sort of having the opportunity for more folks, more parliamentarians to sort of do that questioning and to do that investigation and sort of digging into legislation or whatever it might be, that the more people there are doing that, the better that scrutiny is going to be. So if you can kind of expand the scope of who's able to participate in that by having the hybrid option on the table, then you're actually sort of increasing opportunities for accountability.
Thank you. I think that makes a lot of sense. In terms of you both have chosen to participate today remotely. Why did you choose to participate remotely as opposed to flying all the way to Ottawa?
I mean, I guess I can jump in on that one. I am currently 39 weeks pregnant, so it would not have been an option for me to come to Ottawa. No airline would let me step onto an airplane at this present time. So if that were the case, if the only way for me to have participated were to have been in person, then I would not have had the opportunity to participate. So I guess the sort of family friendliness piece is really kind of the rubber's hitting the road here right now.
And for me, I'm
going to have to share that on the next answer, maybe. Sorry. Thank you. And we are now, Madame Gaudreau, à vous 6 minutes.
It's so interesting. There were such great exchanges. I have 6 minutes and I have various questions. We talk about accountability. There's an option we've been talking about, speaking to one another when we're in a hybrid format, virtually. There's the perception we have and the image that we need to project as parliamentarians. My question is for Ms. Brock. What is the difference between, for example, what you suggested? In the committee, it would be a solution for our witnesses versus our commitment to sit in the House and in the Parliament. I'd like to hear what you have to say about that so that I could hear what the others have to say about it as well. I'm sorry, but my French will... I'm definitely on the mic. Is the interpretation the interpreter is interpreting? Is there anyone who can hear me? Is it okay? Great, thanks. So
in French, that I would not be speaking in French. So the key difference between parliamentarians being in person and witnesses being online goes to two things, first of all. And that is, you can, as some of the literature shows now with parliaments and what we've seen in some jurisdictions in Asia during the pandemic in particular, but also in Europe, is you can bring in witnesses from around the world then much more easily. And so it expands who can actually speak to parliamentarians. The other reason, and it goes back to a point that was raised earlier, when you have witnesses online, it's okay if we're all treated as the same, that we all have the same status. But when parliamentarians are online, you do tend to notice, and I watched the House of Commons with real interest on this to see, but when people are online, the power dynamic is enforced. And so you do get the ministers or the shadow ministers, and the regular parliamentarian is left off a bit. That's why one of my recommendations is that one thing coming out of the pandemic has been a recommendation that speakers' lists be revisited and the speaker be able to choose and recognize more people in Parliament to make it more inclusive. And I argue that that's essential because then people will actually have more opportunities to speak, and perhaps parties will be more inclusive in their lists of speakers as well.
Merci. Nous avons...
Thank you. A few minutes ago, there was a comment made about accountability. Ministers can be accountable virtually. What do you think about that?
Et en anglais, s'il vous plaît, just to clarify the last bit.
I hope I'll have an extra minute, but you can explain in French because interpretation is available. My question: a minister must be accountable. They must answer to the opposition. We heard 2 minutes ago that it was fair, equitable, and appropriate to do so in a virtual format and hybrid format. What are your thoughts about accountability in person versus accountability in a hybrid format when you have a question period, for example? I believe that when ministers answer online,
notes to resort to paper and perhaps not to consider people's reactions or the body language that you get. And so there can often be an inhibiting of an exchange between parliamentarians. And often when a minister or a governing party sees the opposition react strongly to something, then they can take that to caucus and discuss it there. And then you can get some amendments to policies, to ideas that are very fruitful. And we have seen that happen in the past, I think.
Okay. J'ai justement des questions.
I do have questions relating to that. We talked about access to the human being, as we say. On the one hand, would it be possible to get the results when your study will be completed? Of course, it will be very relevant. And the question is for the both of you. In a hybrid context, how can we regain that impromptu, informal exchange, that quality when you go and eat with someone, for example? How can we get back to that? Because there is a consensus, and we did live it here. We did experience this. When we are here all together, we are better equipped to come to a consensus.
Merci beaucoup pour la question.
Thank you for your question.
I think it would be important to separate the idea of like some members of parliament being permanently on hybrid versus actually having the option to use when you need it. And so what we're envisioning is having the option on the table gives members of parliament the flexibility to figure out how best for them to manage their representational work between the work in the House of Commons and within their constituency, depending on the circumstances that they arise. We don't anticipate that this means that some members will always be in the constituency and never appearing inside the actual legislature itself. So For me, those informal functions could still continue. What we're adding is just another tool for MPs to be able to do that work. The other thing that worries me a little bit about prioritizing this informal stuff that's off the books is that I still want to keep pushing but there still needs to be an accountability to the Canadian public about how this work is being done. And so if the reason to take hybrid off as an option completely is in service of all of this informal stuff that is rarely documented, isn't going to appear in Hansard, things along those lines, I think that raises a different accountability issue back to the Canadian public because it's work that we simply don't see.
Absolument. Mais j'ai une dernière.
Absolutely. One final question. You just mentioned that there is the possibility of using the hybrid context, but not all the time. As the chair mentioned this week, can we have an option with various parameters? Any thoughts? Would we have rules, guidelines, without having to share any aspects of our personal lives about that?
Yeah, this gets into the question of design for sure. The one thing that Dr. Raymond and I have spoken about that makes us very nervous is the idea that it would be up to, say, a caucus whip to use access to being able to use hybridity as like it's kind of like, it feels like a sword of Damocles over a member of parliament. And so personally, my preference would be that the rules that would be there or the process that would be there that would allow a member of parliament to use that toolkit would be something that would be at their own discretion, certainly, or operating on their best judgment, the outside of kind of like well, we just don't want to further empower the whips, basically. That's what this comes
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. It's quite fitting because we are moving on to Mrs. Blaney, the whip for the NDP. To you, 6 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, Chair, and I will do my best to go through you as we are meant to do. And yes, I am the NDP whip and have quite a collection and enjoy power, obviously. I do find it really frustrating how people perceive whips. Love to talk with you anytime about what the job really looks like. But I guess for me, one of the things that I note living and working in this place is there is, by the party perspective, an assumption of rightness. And there is not always a consideration of curiosity. And I would really love to have a discussion here that is meaningful about what works in terms of virtual parliament. And I really appreciate what you said about the design, because there are key things that would make the whole of Parliament better. And this is one way that we could make it accessible for some people. Earlier this week, we heard testimony from MPs and former MPs that talked about the challenges that they faced and how much having a format like this would have allowed them to take that time and moment in their lives to address that issue. And so I think it's important that as we talk about this, we talk about the humanity of MPs, but we also talk about the humanity of our communities. There's a few times where I've been here and I've really wanted to be at home because there was a crisis in one of my communities that if I had been able to stand with those people, it would have made them feel comfort from a role that is so important to them. And so I really do hope that we get to a place that we could have consensus, where we talk about what works and what are those systems that might actually allow us to move forward. So I will come to Dr. Thomas and Dr. Raymond. I'll leave it to the two of you to decide. But one of the things that you talked about is having the ability to use the hybrid model if you needed it for one reason or another. And as the whip, I can tell you that I often know things about my caucus's personal life that I wouldn't share broadly, not because of any dastardly sort of power grab, but because I really respect them as human beings. And I want you to know that I perceive the whip's role as really facilitating humanity with a job that often forgets it. So I'm just wondering, in terms of design, how do you see us being able to have this as an option? How would members use that option? And how would they be accountable to their caucus and to Parliament that that is being used in a useful way?
So I'll start and then hand it over to Dr. Thomas maybe to elaborate. But I think certainly you would want to sort of see at the level that sort of applies across the board around sort of here are the parameters, here are the conditions under which it is an option to sort of decide, okay, this week or whatever it is, I'm going to participate remotely from my constituency. Clearly, you're not going to just do that without notifying your caucus, right? But I think sort of notifying the whip versus having the whip sort of say like, well, you've already used hybrid a whole bunch this week or this session or whatever it might be, and that's not going to be allowed, right? I think the concern is more that it becomes sort of one more tool in the potential toolkit for sort of enforcing discipline in a system and in a context where party discipline is already quite strong. So we wouldn't necessarily want to sort of see that be increased. And so I think the idea would be more just that sort of from a logistical and a practical perspective, like of course you would need to notify your caucus and notify your whip so that they know, okay, who's in person, who's remote, whatever, but not necessarily having it be on a sort of providing permission in order to do it kind of way. Dr. Thomas, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it reflects concerns that we see in other options that are used, things like that are used in Westminster in London, pairing, where you would get one member who can't be present, that they'd be paired with somebody else so that you would actually keep the partisan balance. The same on a vote. I mean, the problem that we have with that, and I wrote with my colleague, Dr. Amanda Bittner at Memorial, we wrote something about this in the Canadian Parliamentary Review, specifically with respect to the parental leave policy that's now in place for the Canadian House of Commons, about how these options, like they feel like they're less appropriate because what it means is that it's taking that representational voice for at least one member of parliament or several out of the mix and if you just had a remote voting option and if somebody was in the constituency because they were receiving treatment for a medical condition, if they had just had a labor and delivery, if there was a disaster that had happened in their community, as you had mentioned, and that there was something very compelling and to keep them there, either personal or representational or otherwise, that they would still have the option to be able to come in and do some part of the House duties. That's also part of their job. It's reminiscent of other kinds of, the other thing that cues in my mind about this is how the options for being absent from a legislature, say, are so slow to be updated in Canada precisely because people who are pregnant and like that you can tell that they just never had to deal with somebody who's had to leave because of a labor and delivery. They're not sick, which means, so I know in Alberta, the Alberta legislature didn't address this. There's a 10-day permitted absence unless there's an illness, and they had to change it to include pregnancy because the existing measure wasn't appropriate. And so it strikes me as a holistic way to think about what's going on in people's lives. And also it's a good opportunity to think about what's going on with constituency representation and how that can be better balanced to accommodate work in the House as well. I think the thing that would be disheartening for us would be if it would devolve into some of the existing patterns that we think maybe that create some of the things that we identify as dysfunction in the literature in terms of how the institution works.
Thank you, Mrs. Blaney. Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Mr. Calkins. 5 minutes to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question is for Professor Brock. I've got a question for you. Just generally speaking, I found your intervention at the start or your opening remarks to be quite well thought out and reflect a really mature knowledge of actually how Parliament works. I'm going to premise by saying every one of us here is a representative. I represent every single person in my constituency, 128,000 people, men, women, people of different color, people of different ethnic origins, people of every bit as much diversity in my constituency as there would be in some of the other ridings, most of the other ridings in this country. So I actually don't subscribe to the point of view that I don't understand an issue because I'm not from a particular culture or from a particular, I have a particular upbringing or whatever the case might be. On any given day, I might be discussing the regulations and rules pertaining to how an aircraft lands, every bit as much as I'm talking about how to make the quality of life for my constituents better. And I think everybody that gets elected is more than capable of being able to represent everybody in their constituency and all of their needs. And we somewhat become subject matters on all of these issues. My concern is if we're not present, if you don't go to class, For example, it's hard to learn. As a former teacher at a college myself, that was the job I had before I came here. I taught some classes virtually, computer programming, and I taught some in person, and I can tell you the ones that I taught in person, the people left with a much greater understanding than the ones that I taught virtually. So given that, and I don't subscribe to the notion that we have to be a diverse group in the House to have diverse opinions representing the people that we represent, because I think people are, regardless, able to do that. I've got a question in the quality of our democracy. And I heard Ms. Thomas say that if somebody is making a debate or a speech in the House of Commons, that somehow changes the ebb and flow of how a policy or piece of legislation is actually changed. My experience in 17 years of being here as a member of Parliament is that it's the conversations that you have outside the room, in the hallway, after the committee is done, when we suspend our committees for 5 minutes, which chairs will often do, and then we come back, all of a sudden the committee is now getting along fine because the people that were in the room were able to have a conversation and sort these things out. Can you talk about the effectiveness? I'm worried about the effectiveness and the quality of the decisions that are made. This is supposed to be a place where people get together and the good ideas bubble to the top to the benefit of all. And if we're not here, my concern is, if we're not here, or at least not enough of us are here, on an ongoing basis, that we're not going to get the best decision.
Thank you very much for that. I agree. And I'm going to answer this in a couple of ways. I really respect my colleagues' work. I think they make some excellent points. I do think it's not a question of mode. This is a question of how Parliament functions and what people learn from each other. And in my brief, I have a short anecdote, which I'm going to share with you. My students 2 weeks ago divided into groups, and instead of putting them pre-assigned, I let them self-select. These are graduate students. And when I walked around to all the groups, I noticed that they had self-selected into binary option sex groups, and also by race. So male, female, apparently, in them. And as I walked around, I asked them, what happened? And they said, well, I'm more comfortable here. And then one of the students said to me, who was a student from the Middle Eastern community in Toronto, and he said, Prof, you have to remember we're the first generation to be entirely online as undergrads. So we're still operating the way we did in high school. We aren't crossing the divisions the way that you're forced to do in university when you work together on a more professional way. And so I think with Parliament, if you continue to go online, then that does break down that integrative function that Parliament has. And I think it's more mature to realize that Parliament, in all its richness and its wisdom, and I have a lot of respect for all of you here because you have tough lives, I understand that. But Parliament has found ways to accommodate people, ways to adjust. The reason why I mentioned the washrooms was because in the 1990s, the big studies on women in politics were that the women's washrooms were always in the corner of the building. Now they've moved them to be more central. And that's because women were there in person.
Thank you, Dr. Brock. Thank you, Mr. Calkins. Ms. Sahota, 5 minutes to you, and then we'll switch to the next panel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've really enjoyed all of the exchanges, and I have to say there's parts I agree with. I agree with a lot of things that have been said, and I also question some of the things that have been said as well. At some points, it seems like we may be talking about a virtual parliament versus an in-person parliament, and I think we all agree that in-person activity has its benefits. The side room talks and, those have its benefits. We are all here. We're functioning in a hybrid parliament today, and all of the committee members are here in person sitting at this table with the exception of a couple of witnesses, which wouldn't have been able to testify today had they not had this hybrid option. So I want to talk a little bit about the diversity that we were talking about. Yes, it's good to make sure we have that diversity in the room. I believe Professor Brock talked about some modernization we did in women's bathrooms, lights flashing, all of those things have happened so long ago. There's modernization we've talked about electronic voting. That's all the technology is all there, available in our desks at the House of Commons, but we haven't been able to come to consensus on some of those issues. So I wanted to, is it important for us to now take it a step further, now that the pandemic has shown us what is possible and how inclusive this place, how much more inclusive this place can be? Should we be looking at those things? Should we be adopting from what we have learned in the pandemic, how we have improved our technology, or should we be happy with the flashing lights and the fact that we have women's bathrooms today? And my question goes to Professor Thomas, if you could start.
I think that if we are serious about representing the Canadian public, that it's worth paying close attention to the empirical evidence from decades of research that shows how who is in the room matters. And so while I believe that every representative will do a good and sincere job of representing all of their constituents in all of their diversity, there still is the reality that as individuals we have different lived experiences, and that gives us a different lens on the world, and that shapes how we think about questions of evidence, that thinks about questions of priorities, and I mean, it is something that has profoundly shapes how we all see the world, and that is actually relevant to policy and how the work does. I'd like to turn it to Dr. Raymond, because this is the subject of some deep systematic work that she's done with how speech has worked inside decades of the Canadian Parliament, and I think that evidence is really important to bring to bear here.
Sure. So yeah, my dissertation, soon to be book research, hopefully, it looks at sort of these patterns of speech, right? And sort of how do different parliamentarians speak differently about different issues? And the evidence really does show, at least when it comes to women, I haven't had the opportunity to sort of look at representation of other groups, but at least when it comes to women parliamentarians, and again, this is regardless of party affiliation, they are more likely to speak about women and to sort of raise issues that relate to women. So sort of having in place measures that make it possible for women to participate in Parliament, and likely for other underrepresented groups to participate in Parliament, that brings in new perspectives. So I think to sort of the question about should we think about having a hybrid option, right? The option to participate virtually, sort of think about, is this a thing that can be used on a continued basis moving forward, now that we've sort of been forced to think about how do we do this in the context of the pandemic? Is this something that we can leverage to improve how Parliament functions? I think that we can think about hybridity as sort of like just the next stage in the evolution of things like having the lights flashing as well as the bells ringing when it's time to vote. It's sort of the next thing of sort of making Parliament more inclusive, in the same way as we can sort of think about having women's washrooms, right? That this is another sort of step that we can have, that it's not necessarily in the sort of physical space of Parliament Hill, but it's another tool that can be used to ensure that Parliament is more inclusive and diverse.
Before having hybrid parliament or virtual parliament at the very beginning days, when ministers were not here, they were not here. When they were traveling often in my first few terms here, many ministers had work to do outside of the House, outside of Parliament, and they just physically weren't present, so they weren't virtually present either, and they were not answering questions in the House of Commons. Any thoughts on that?
I have to save that for later. Sorry, your time just ran out. And we are going to be switching panels. I just really want to thank everyone for their time today. It's an invigorating conversation. So I thank you all for bringing the perspectives you have. I want you to know that PROC committee members appreciate your time. Should you want to add anything, please just send it in writing to the clerk. With that, keep well and safe. Dr. Raymond, we look forward to an update, but I hope everyone keeps well and safe. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah.
Our second panel today for our review of the House of Commons virtual hybrid proceedings provisions pursuant to House Order on June 23rd, 2022. Our second panel is the Canadian Association of Professional Employees, represented by Andre Picotte, acting president, and Paul Antonelli, and Local 900 acting president, interpreters representative on Local 900 council. We also have the International Association of Conference Interpreters, Linda Ballantyne, the president, as well as Jim Thompson, communication and parliamentary advisor. And then we have the Translation Bureau, represented by Matthew Ball, Acting Chief Executive Officer, Public Services and Procurement Canada, and Carolyn Corneau, Acting Vice President, Service to Parliament and Interpretation. We'll start with, I'll just ask everyone to make sure our earpieces are in if you have a preferred language. And if you have any issues, let us know. We'll assist. This is a new comment we'll be adding moving forward. Opening comments, starting with Andre. Welcome. Picotte. Bienvenue.
Merci.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you for allowing me to speak about this very important issue. My name is Andre Picotte. I'm acting president of the Canadian Association of Professional Employees. I am normally vice president. I am joined by Paul Antonelli, Cape Local 900 acting president and interpreters representative. CAPE is the third largest federal public sector union, representing over 23,000 economists, policy analysts, statisticians, researchers in the Library of Parliament, and analysts in the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, as well as some 80 professional interpreters in the federal public sector. I would like to extend our warm greetings to the interpreters who are here today and thank them and their colleagues for their exceptional work. Since Parliament pivoted to hybrid settings in the face of COVID-19, interpreters' work has been hampered by technical glitches and participants' poor compliance with technical standards. Since 2020, hearing issues have led 33 out of 70 official languages interpreters to take some 349 sick days. In any given month, 10 or so interpreters are reassigned to other duties on doctor's orders. CAPE advocated with the Translation Bureau and MPs of all parties and appeared in front of several parliamentary committees. With no clear resolution in sight to the interpreters' ongoing health and safety problems, CAPE finally filed a complaint on February 1st, 2022 with the Labour Program of Employment and Social Development Canada. They found that the Translation Bureau had failed to protect its employees' health and safety in view of new technological hazards, clearly identified in the National Research Council's October 2021 report on sound quality on Parliament Hill. The AV team had efforts to improve sound for interpreters have reportedly run into some incompatibilities between the House AV systems and Zoom. Even if NRC tests over the Thanksgiving break confirmed that interpreters now get the full frequency range required by ISO standards, there's been no perceived improvement in sound quality since problems were first measured back in May 2021. Stéphane Auby has admitted without hesitation that the sound received during hybrid formats is never ISO compliant. The Translation Bureau has yet to apply to parliamentary interpreters the instructions issued for interpreted government conferences, that interpreters should never attempt to provide interpretation when basic technical requirements are not met. Madam Chair, members of the committee, in closing, let me reiterate that interpreters are your main allies to ensure that the message you convey to your constituents and other Canadians is faithfully relayed in the other official language with all its nuances. In-person meetings provide the best sound with the least amount of strain. Problems arise if even one member or witness is participating remotely. However, since hybrid committee meetings are sittings are probably here to stay, it is imperative to mitigate their consequences on our members' health and their ability to go on working in their field. And how shall we do that? Improve sound quality provided by the AV system and make sure that remote participants meet basic technical requirements. Thank you again to interpreters for doing their very best in incredibly challenging conditions since the pandemic hit. Thank you for your time and your attention. We look forward to answering your questions. Thank you very much. Ms. Ballantyne.
Merci.
Thank you for inviting AIC Canada to share its reflections about these deliberations. We are part of a worldwide organization representing interpreters all over the world.
Interested in working with the Translation Bureau, or the TB, as we call it, to ensure that it remains a center of linguistic excellence, offering the best working conditions to its suppliers so as to provide the highest quality services while safeguarding interpreters' health and well-being over the course of their careers. At the beginning of the pandemic, to its credit, the TB took steps to ensure quality and interpreter safety by reducing the number of hours of work in virtual settings. It's widely understood that in-person settings where interpreters are in the same room as active speakers offer the best conditions for quality interpretation. It's also widely understood that interpreting remote participants over the internet increases cognitive load and has caused auditory disorders and injuries amongst interpreters the world over. Despite what you have heard from the House of Commons administration on Tuesday, the National Research Council's testing has proven that the House of Commons AV system distorts Zoom, so the sound delivered from remote participants to interpreters becomes both unintelligible and a serious health hazard. And this is a key point. The House administration testified to your committee on Tuesday this week that the House of Commons audio system meets ISO standards. Omitted from their testimony is that this is true only for in-person sound. Audio from remote participant continues to be dangerous and frequently unintelligible, placing quality interpretation and the health and safety of interpreters at risk. Interpreting remote interventions is what has generated many problems. The science is not sufficiently advanced to have definite answers to the causes, but empirically, given the number of injuries we've witnessed since virtual Parliament in Canada, we know there is a serious problem. AIC Canada believes the special conditions of work instituted for virtual settings need to remain unchanged for hybrid meetings. Canada would be following the lead of the Pan-European Human Rights Organization and the Council of Europe, which have decided on conditions applicable to hybrid meetings. For instance, should the total number of remote interventions amount to less than 25 minutes over the course of an interpreter's entire working day, the meeting will be classified as in-person. Should the total number of remote interventions last between 25 and 50 minutes, the meeting will be classified as hybrid with no changes in working hours, but with extra financial compensation. And I would like to discuss financial compensation if you're interested during question period. Should the total number of remote interventions exceed 50 minutes over the course of an entire day, the meeting will be classified as full remote with increased team strength or shorter working hours, plus financial compensation. In Canada, the TB intends to go in the opposite direction. It's already offering assignments under pre-pandemic hours of work for virtual hybrid meetings. They are not waiting for verification of the House audio system, which, is saying it's fine for in-person meetings. And this misses the point entirely anyway. The TB is requiring that a majority of participants need to be remote before special conditions kick in to protect quality and interpreter health. And this is what makes no sense. What matters is who is doing the most talking, those in the room or those connecting remotely. A hybrid policy to protect quality and our safety should be based on this consideration. We know that most airtime of committee meetings is occupied by witnesses, many of whom will continue to connect remotely to save money, time, the planet, and because some are pregnant, as we've just heard earlier today. Your colleagues on Lang, by unanimous motion to the House, have expressed concern about interpreters' auditory health. If hybrid meetings are to be a fixture of the House in the future, we urge you to weigh in too in order to protect quality and our health. Je veux être bien clair. Laïc Canada n'est pas contre les nouvelles technologies qui permettent un Parlement.
I want to make it clear that it goes without saying that you're responsible for how the House wants to continue. We ask you to ensure quality service takes precedence, and all Canadians and parliamentarians are allowed to receive. We should be protecting the health, protecting quality and safety of interpreters. Mr. Ball.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Matthew Ball. I'm the acting CEO of the Translation Bureau. We're part of Public Services and Procurement Canada. And with me today is Caroline Corneau, who is the acting Vice President of Services to Parliament and Interpretation. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered today on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Honourable members of the committee, thank you for inviting us to participate in this panel alongside Monsieur Picotte, Madame Antonelli, Ms. Valentine, and Mr. Thompson from the Canadian Association of Professional Employees and from the International Association of Conference Interpreters. These long-standing partners of the Bureau are valuable allies in our efforts to ensure quality interpretation services for our clients and optimal working conditions for our interpreters. As a Centre of Excellence in Linguistic Services, the Translation Bureau is proud to provide interpretation for the House of Commons. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to speak about the interpretation of virtual sessions in the context of your study on hybrid proceedings. Please note, however, that the Translation Bureau is not responsible for the technical environment in which the interpreters work. Depuis les débuts de la pandémie, nos interprètes, comme d'autres professionnels,
Since the beginning of the pandemic, interpreters, just like others, have provided essential services. I would like to thank the freelancers and the interpreters, as well as our partners here, for their devotion. Health and safety is the priority of the Translation Bureau. We have therefore implemented measures to protect our interpreters during hybrid formats with the help of our partners in the House. For example, speaking during a hybrid reunion without the appropriate equipment makes the sound worse and forces interpreters to interrupt the service. The administration of the House has also sent headsets to witnesses and to our MPs in order to improve the sound, and I thank all of you for using that equipment.
There is a shortage of interpreters, not just in Canada, but around the world. To wit, the Translation Bureau, the largest employer of interpreters in Canada, has only some 70 staff interpreters in official languages. However, we're fortunate to be able to benefit from a pool of freelance interpreters available to help, but even the private sector capacity is limited. We have approximately 60 freelance interpreters in official languages serving parliamentarians, and their availability varies depending on the demands of their personal lives and their other clients. This means we have to be very agile in matching our supply with the demand. We are aware of the challenges this causes you as our clients, and rest assured that we are making every effort to improve or increase our capacity. Among other things, we continue to hire every new graduate in official languages from the only 2 Master of Conference Interpreting programs in Canada. One's taught at the University of Ottawa here, and the other one's at Glendon College at York University. We're also about to hold our annual accreditation exam in official languages in November. We anticipate that this will allow us to add several new interpreters to our pool of qualified suppliers. De plus, nous avons participé cet été au projet pilote mené par la...
In addition, this summer we participated in the pilot project conducted by the House Administration to determine whether interpretation services could be provided by interpreters off-site of Parliament, which could expand our pool. Honourable members of the committee, the Translation Bureau is working hard to serve you well while protecting its interpreters. Although in-person sessions offer the best conditions for interpretation, we know that virtual and hybrid meetings will remain a reality. That is why, with the help of our partners in Canada and abroad, we will continue to gather data, seek innovative solutions, and cultivate the next generation of interpreters in order to meet the needs of the House should it decide to maintain virtual and hybrid sessions. It will now be our pleasure to take your questions.
Thank you very much for those comments. I will tell you that I think I can speak for all members and reassure you, I hope, that this conversation is one that we'll be learning a lot from and wanting to ensure that our interpreters succeed. You are definitely essential to the work that we do, a country with 2 official languages, so we do thank you for giving us the time and the important work you do. We will start with 6-minute rounds, starting with Mr. Calkins, followed by Mr. Turnbull, Madame Gaudreau, and then Mrs. Blaney. Mr. Calkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I will echo the wise words that she said. I am a unilingual member of Parliament, and I rely completely on the interpretive services that are provided here. And in the 17-some years that I've been here, I want to say thank you very much for enabling me to do my job to represent my constituents. So I'm going to start off first with the Translation Bureau, Mr. Ball. I want to talk a little bit about the notion of witnesses appearing at committee prior to Zoom being used. So prior to Zoom, we had video and teleconferencing capabilities for witnesses to appear. Was that system better for the health and well-being of our interpreters than Zoom is?
If I may answer the question. We were doing remote interpreting services prior to that. I wouldn't say it was better. I hesitate to describe or speak with any authority on sound quality and issues, but anecdotally, we had problems prior to the pandemic and prior to the adoption of Zoom. We had service interruptions when interpreters were providing the services for witnesses remotely.
Has the Bureau been approached by Parliament or the government to circumvent the Bureau being the only provider of translation services here? And has it ever been suggested that interpreters could be remote as well as witnesses?
If I may answer the question. The Bureau's mandate is to serve parliamentarians as they see fit. We're not privy to conversations in camera. And as I said, we do our best to work in collaboration with the House administration. Our first priority is the health and safety of interpreters, and our second priority is providing parliamentarians the services they expect and they deserve. So the Bureau has had conversations, but there's been no specific requests that I could speak to.
Has the advent of hybrid or virtual Parliament hastened the departure of members of your Bureau for health and safety reasons or other reasons because of the workload or the potential for harm? And are you recruiting as fast as you are losing?
If I may, Madam Chair. If I understand the question correctly, sorry, could I get the question repeated? I'm just not sure I understood the nuance.
Has the workload as a result of hybrid Parliament hastened the departure of people who might have been close to retirement, or anybody for that matter, from the service? So I guess I'm asking, there will be a normal ebb and flow. There will be normal succession planning. You would have demographics in your organization where people were expected to retire and maintain a full career. I'm asking you, has have things changed outside the expected realm of when people would be moving on or leaving the Bureau or not willing to work for the Bureau anymore as a result of using Zoom or hybrid Parliament?
It's a difficult question for me to answer, Madam Chair. Yes, people take retirements as they have. I would be speculating as to the cause of how much or how often our freelance interpreters are working for us. I could maybe speak anecdotally. Working in the pandemic was a challenge for interpreters, like it was for many professionals across the country and around the world. We asked interpreters, it's an essential service, they had to come on to Parliament Hill, they had to leave their homes and their families, they had to come and work in a booth that's 4 foot by 4 feet with 3 people together during the middle of an airborne pandemic. So it was a challenge. We worked really hand in glove with the House administration, who eventually provided for individual booths, which was a great relief to our staff and to our freelancers. We had very close collaboration with the association, or the union, and AIC as well. We communicated constantly with them to ensure that everyone felt safe and that they could do their jobs and they could support parliamentarians. So I don't want to avoid the answer, but there's been a shift. I would say some people, we have 20 fewer suppliers on our open contract since last year. So I can't tell you the reasons why, but it is a reality.
So the second part of my question, and I would like Ms. Ballantyne to weigh in on this as well, is your recruitment replacing what you're losing?
If I may, sure. Yes, we're doing. We are working on multiple fronts to increase our capacity. We support teaching at the University of Ottawa and at Glendon College. We are doing accreditation exams annually. Last year, we ran an exam and had about 10 new interpreters. We've hired 10 new interpreters this year, recent graduates. So we're constantly working to improve the pool of qualified interpreters. This is nothing new for the Bureau because interpretation has always been a shortage group, even before the pandemic. I think the pandemic, like other professions, as I said, has been tough for people, but we're working constantly on many fronts.
Ms. Ballantyne?
Thank you, if I may. We would agree with what Matthew Ball has stated. There is being a lot of attention paid right now to trying to increase capacity. AIC Canada conducted a survey July and August, and we have identified that indeed there have been people leaving the profession because of difficult conditions, and but we believe that it's very difficult, even if all stakeholders are working to help increase capacity, there are big challenges. We only have 2 programs, master's programs in Canada. We believe that there needs to be a much bigger investment in a bilingual country such as ours to be able to train interpreters.
Thank you. Monsieur Fergus, vous la parole, 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Mr. Fergus, 6 minutes. I'd like to thank all of the witnesses present today, especially our interpreters. As the chair explained at the very beginning of this session, your work is crucial for us to be able to do our job. And this is the heart of democracy in Canada. So, as you can see, you are essential. And I do empathize with the working conditions that you are subject to. Mr. Picot, maybe I misunderstood your opening statement, but did I understand correctly that you said that the best solution is to have no, or to have only in-person meetings, or did I misunderstand? What I said essentially is that ideally that would be the case. In-person meetings would be ideal, but we do understand that hybrid sessions are here to stay. So we do have to adapt to that. But the Parliament also has to adapt to the needs of the interpreters and respect the right to health and safety. Thank you. Before the pandemic and before the hybrid system was adopted, we sometimes had witnesses or people who participated by teleconference. Is there a difference in the quality of the sound through a telephone and the quality of sound through Zoom? The sound, thank you for the question. Yes. Ms. Antonelli, you corrected me. Apologies to the chair. The sound that comes through the telephone is one of the worst for interpreters. So it's better? So Zoom is better generally. Mr. Ball.
Help us out on this question. There have been a number of steps which the Translation Bureau has taken, I think, to try to improve the quality of the sound and conditions in which the interpreters work. This was brought to us in the testimony that we had earlier this week. I know you spoke to it in your presentation. Could you just give us a bit more of an understanding, and also could you scope ahead as to what you think the work still remains to be done to provide a safe and secure environment for our interpreters?
Madam Chair. Thank you. We've done a lot. In the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, we were really scurrying. I will admit it. Over the last 2 years, we've done quite a few initiatives. I can speak to them briefly. We've developed and implemented an interpreter hearing protection program. This involves training and research and testing in 3 areas: acoustics, sound, interpreting function, and audiology. We shortened the assignment length. We did that immediately in the aftermath from 6 hours at the microphone to 4 hours. We've developed and implemented some technical requirements for our Government of Canada clients. These are now requirements. It is, in order to be interpreted, speakers must use a directional external microphone. We've required sound tests before meetings to improve sound quality and to minimize disruptions. And we've sponsored ongoing research with external partners, partnerships with the National Research Council here in the House of Commons facilities, with the University of Geneva as well, to improve the working environment for our staff. So I could say that we've had a very close collaboration, not just with the House Administration, but with the AIC and the association as well.
If I may, Madam Chair, it's important to remember that freelance interpreters contribute 40 to 45% of all the assignments that are done on the Hill, almost half, but do not have access to the programs and whatnot that Mr. Ball just talked about, and are not able to file health and safety incident reports because freelancers are just that, they're not employees.
With that, Mr. Thompson, you'll forgive me. I'm going to have to think about what you just said. I was on a that's just fine, and I'm glad that you did. 1 minute left. Mr. Ball, very quickly, we heard testimony that the testing didn't take into account the current, or the testing is not adequate. I'd like to just find out from you, did the testing that you've done in the summer, or the latest round of testing, was it using the unidirectional microphones that are now standard for members of Parliament and witnesses to House affairs? Is it being done with the latest set of headsets that we have and microphones?
We have asked the National Research Council to test the models of the directional microphones that the House of Commons is using. Yes, that is correct.
And we will have results of that at some point?
Yes, there was a series of first tests, and we're conducting more tests in October, and we hope to get results shortly thereafter.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Madame Gaudreau, 6 minutes.
Ms. Gaudreau, 6 minutes. Thank you. Thank you for allowing us to better understand what you're experiencing and the challenge ahead of us, and thank you to the interpreters as well. I really do have a lot of questions, and I'm going to read them to make sure I don't miss any of them. For Mr. Ball, you may have heard on Tuesday I did ask some questions, I'd like to know how many interpreters are necessary in order to maintain the daily committee sessions when there are normally 57 sessions per week. It's quite precise, but that will be the nature of my questions. I will defer to Caroline Corneau, who is our interim vice president. The answer is difficult because the number of sessions varies actually daily. You talked about weekly. Well, if you haven't done the math, then we can wait. But if you do have the answer, it's quite important. I can't give you a specific number, but what I can say, apologies, Madam Chair, Ms. Chair, we do work with the House of Commons in order to establish the calendar, and we do try to fulfill all the needs. So it's important to try to do the math. How many interpreters were required, Madam Chair, to ensure interpretation during that number of sessions, but before the pandemic? Because maybe you will give me the number later, but I'd like to have a before and after. I'll ask Ms. Corneau to answer. Madam Chair, what I can say is that the conditions before the pandemic were completely different from what's happening now. So it's very difficult to know because there are so many factors to consider in order to count how many interpreters we need for a certain amount of events. I don't have the number, but the sub-answer would be that it would be very difficult to provide that. Madam Chair, we are trying to understand the impact and on these professionals, on professionals in general, so that we can all do our job. So I'm trying to just have a landscape in front of me, so that I do think that it's a relevant question. We did speak previously about incidents and accidents. I haven't seen any numbers. Can we, with what we've just experienced in the last 2 years, I'd like to know the numbers with regards to how many incidents have arisen since the pandemic. Again, I'll defer to Ms. Corneau. Ms. Corneau, you can just answer. For 2022, we got about 90 incident reports up until September 2022. So if I understand correctly, it is a question of prevention as well. It allows us to work on prevention. Do we have any numbers from before the pandemic, or is 90 really an incredible number? Well, the incidents that we're talking about are linked to the quality of sound, which is linked to the virtual system that we are experiencing now. So that's what we've been hearing, is that there's the hybrid format. There could have been some prevention done, and there are some accidents that have happened. So there have been injuries, auditive, hearing injuries. That what we've heard just now is that where the sound is coming from has an impact. So what are the how many injuries have there had? Well, there are a lot of subtleties with regards to what an injury is. So if we talk about 2022, no employee has a long-term sick leave because of an injury. So that is that's good news, if you can call it that. There are symptoms, there are situations that could have happened, or, for example, a risk to health and safety, which don't necessarily amount to injuries or to an accident as such. So with regards to the data, with the 90 plus reports, 70% are a declaration of an incident. So it's not necessarily linked to an injury or an injury that invalidates the interpreter. 30%, however, are invalidating, and therefore there needs to be a one-day sick leave or a period of accommodation. So I imagine, since our priority is safety and security and accessibility, so can we ask you to have a perspective that has a direct link between the accidents? Is there a link between the hybrid sessions and the accidents?
Those numbers would be great, or any insights.
Merci.
And you all know very well that I like when everything goes through the chair, so because you interpret it. But today I'm noticing that the tone and temperament between us is nice because we know how hard you work, because you're sitting right in front of us. But if you weren't, we sometimes lose sight of the work you do. So that's where I'm not interrupting to say you have to go through the speaker just to get through the chair, just so you can get maximum time. Mrs. Blaney, 6 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair. And of course, I thank all of you for being here. And I have a great respect for the interpreters. They make my life a lot easier, and I'm very, very grateful to them. So thank you for being here. So my first questions I'm going to hand over to the International Association of Conference Interpreters. I'll let you decide who should answer. But one of the things that I found interesting about what you said today was you talked about the House administration doing some testing, and that you felt that their testimony was true only for in-person sound as opposed to remote sound. I'm just wondering if you could explain that a little bit more.
Thank you for the question. We
Yes.
very little information about the most recent testing that's been conducted by the House administration's experts. We have received no report. We have been aware of testing that's been going on for 2 years. The Translation Bureau brought in the NRC to do testing because of injuries and interested in trying to understand what's going on. And those tests showed a number of conclusions, namely that the House administration's AV systems had problems, in addition to the problems we understand come with these platforms such as Zoom. When the NRC presented its findings, the House administration brought in its own experts. Our understanding is that the House administration did not agree with the findings of the NRC. And we believe there's been a bit of a ping-pong game going on. We are waiting for the House administration's findings, and now we have the NRC going back in, have apparently conducted more tests just recently, testing again on Thanksgiving weekend. From what we understand, it is to validate what the House administration's experts have concluded. And we've lost sight at this point of what the NRC concluded already some time ago. So we are in the dark about what is happening with the testing. All we know is we continue to have injuries, and this has been going on for far too long. Thanks.
I might, if I could just add, the committee is in the dark as well. You are, because the House administration told you on Tuesday that they are not prepared to give you the results of that report.
Okay, well, thank you for that. One of the things that I'm interested in, and you mentioned it earlier, is that freelancers are not putting in safety applications and so on. So are you guys tracking in any way what's happening for freelancers?
Thank you very much. It is very unfortunate that we as freelancers and this is around the world, because freelancers around the world are suffering injuries, and freelancers are offering services in institutions around the world where the institutions are doing some tracking. But here, we are a small association. We are all volunteers. It is very difficult for us to track. We would rely entirely on our freelancers reporting to us. We don't have an infrastructure to track. We have talked about it in AIC International to try to figure out how we could do that. At this point, it is not what we are doing. It's purely anecdotal. But I can tell you that some of the anecdotes are very, very disturbing, very upsetting. We do have interpreters who, since these platforms have started being used, since the pandemic, who are unable to work and will never be able to work again.
Thank you so much. I've only got a minute and a bit left, so I just want to take an opportunity to ask a question of from Cape. Again, I'll let whoever decide who wants to answer that. I guess I have two questions. One is, there was mention of hearing issues. Could you just elaborate a little bit of what type of issues there are in terms of the hearing issues? And secondly, what do you believe the House administration could do to improve interpreters' working conditions during hybrid or remote meetings?
We've chosen to talk about the hearing issues because there's a wide range, and they go from tinnitus, which most of us have at this stage, which was not the case before the pandemic, to most of us interpreters, I mean, maybe parliamentarians too, with the amount you spend, time you spend online, but we need better sound for our work. So tinnitus, that's the lowest thing, and then goes on to hypersensitivity to noise. Like if you have interpreters around, they will wince if you drop a knife on a plate.
I was so intrigued where you were going with that, but the bell rang. Mr. Viss, 5 minutes to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses here today. Je suis un...
I am a man who speaks very loudly sometimes, but only sometimes. During the pandemic, was it difficult for you when someone like myself raised their voice in order to make a point in the House of Commons?
Thank you for the question. We have a volume control button on our console in the booth. So
no, it's a serious question. I'm not trying to. It's a serious question, please.
It is a serious question, and we take your question very seriously. Yeah. But it is a fact. Interpreters during the pandemic have been working with their fingers on their volume control. And one of the issues we have with hybrid, where you would have people in the room and coming in online, is this lack of level, is discrepancy between the sound that comes into our ears. It's a different quality sound, it's a different volume of sound, the texture of sound. So all we have is a volume button.
Thank you. That's a really important answer. In your opinion, Ms. Ballantyne, did I pronounce that correctly? Ballantyne, my apologies. The way we're doing things now, is this sustainable for your profession? And if hybrid is adopted on a permanent basis, do you think that's sustainable for your essential service?
What you ask is a very important and crucial question. We keep insisting that in-person sound is the best quality sound for us to work with. Anything that's not in-person sound is going to be very, very difficult for us to work with, produces poor quality, and is dangerous.
Thank you. Concernant le bilinguisme, quand je suis ici à Ottawa,
when I'm here in Ottawa, I can speak with my colleague, Ms. Gaudreau, in French. When I'm home alone. I don't speak any French with anyone. So would the hybrid mode, has it diminished the level of bilingualism in Canada, in your opinion? I wouldn't know. I think that parliamentarians make very big efforts to speak both languages, and their colleagues of the other official languages appreciate it very much.
Country, we have an Official Languages Act. It's there in place precisely because not all of us speak the two languages, and everyone is entitled to be able to understand everything that goes on in our democracy. That's why we have interpretation. Now,
right. So this is what I'm trying to get at.
So this is the big challenge we have. What we have is a challenge. We're here because we have a huge challenge. Our challenge here in the Canadian Parliament is all the more huge because we have a shortage of interpreters. We don't disagree that there's a shortage everywhere, but here we do.
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt. I'm really trying to make an important point. Anecdotally, do you find that because of hybrid parliament, Anglophones speak more English than French in a hybrid setting than in a non-hybrid setting?
Well, Canada did conduct a survey dating back, I think it was to December of 2021, and indeed we have found, measuring the amount of time spoken in Parliament by different parliamentarians of different languages, that English has predominated, and French has, been stuffed out.
Thank you. That's really disappointing to hear. Finally, hier dans la Chambre des communes.
Yesterday in the House, somebody was in the car and we heard music in the House. And we heard it in a case like that, is that something that is dangerous for interpreters when somebody is cannot control the sound in their vehicle? I was in the House at that time. The system did not transmit the sound to our consoles. It wasn't loud.
Okay. Merci. Madame.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente, et j'aimerais remercier tous nos témoins.
Thank you, and I would like to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. I have some questions to follow up on Mr. Culkin.
I was elected in 2015. On committees, we had a lot of video conferencing for witnesses that would come, to testify. And I was actually surprised to learn, and this has been helpful, that the quality of the audio on the video conference that we would use back prior to hybrid, that the quality wasn't very good. And I know that witnesses would not be using the headsets. They would not be using good microphones. And now to learn, Madame Antonelli, que le pire chose, c'est le téléphone. And I know during the pandemic, at the very beginning, we were doing daily phone calls of parliamentarians where you had, telephone, the very bad quality telephone, but on top of that, 338 parliamentarians trying to speak. So it's actually helpful for us to know that, because we do often use the telephone for caucus calls and so on, that it's actually not very good. And I know I don't use a headset when I'm on a phone call. You're listening to the phone call. So thank you for letting us know that. That is very helpful. In terms of how we do what we do, I know, for instance, to make sure that I keep a distance from the microphone so I don't pop in your ears, to not yell in the chamber when, for interpreters. Are there other things that we can be doing? I know wearing our proper headsets. Are there other recommendations that you could give us as parliamentarians? So if we are on a teleconference that we're maybe using a headset, if you would like to elaborate, and I'll have another question as well.
I'm sure you've heard the recommendations before about where to put the headsets between your mouth and your nose. And some MPs have recurring bad connections. They just live in a corner of the country where connections are bad. And it would be important for those MPs to provide notes, if at all possible.
Okay.
And if they have notes and are using them, and to speak as slowly as possible so that they can in some way compensate for how poor the connection is.
I'd like to add another thing that could be done, and that relates to the approach to the rules that apply for the conditions that apply for interpreters working in remote settings. They need to take into account that remote sound is damaging, dangerous, and like other institutions have done, take steps to limit exposure to that sound. And also to define what is a remote meeting in a way that takes into account or what is an in-person meeting in a way that takes into account the fact that there are remote participants. Any remote sound is dangerous, and we'd encourage your committee to recognize that in whatever recommendations you might make.
Thank you for that. And I'm just going to add, I know that in a previous parliament, I chaired committee, and I know that one thing that was very difficult for interpreters is when the members or would talk over the witness or cut them off, the back and forth. It doesn't help in terms of interpretation. So just another little friendly reminder to our members not to do that. My next question is for Mr. Ball. You talked a little bit about the pool or the pipeline of talent that you're looking to develop. There's people who are taking the 2 master's programs. It was a great recommendation perhaps to invest in some of those programs so that we can entice more people to consider a career in interpretation. So you mentioned you have some already on staff. You have some, have identified some as freelance that can assist. I understand from Madame Corneau, we do have enough interpreters at the moment to fill the 57 slots over the course of a week. With the potential addition of new recruits coming through, if we were to invest in maybe some more programs in training, would that help make sure that you have that buffer in terms of the pipeline of talent that you will need going forward? Merci. Sorry.
We would welcome the answer to that in writing, if that's okay. Madame Gaudreau, question très vite.
Ms. Gaudreau, a quick question. Thank you. I forgot to ask a question earlier. You spoke about injuries, and Madam Chair, I'm speaking to Mr. Ball or Ms. Corneau. You spoke about invalidating injuries that cause people to miss work. Did I understand correctly? In your report, ultimately, I would like for the witnesses to add where these injuries happened, in which context. That's all. If you'd be able to add that, that'd be great. Thank you. Yes, we'll be able to provide you with that information. I don't have the precise data with me, so instead of maybe giving erroneous information, I'd rather include it in the final report. And if you have any information regarding to, the committees versus the House of Commons, all of those details would be fantastic. Thank you.
Just before we adjourn, there's one fact that I wanted to leave with the committee, and that arises from a survey of all freelance interpreters we did in July. 80% participated. And the shocking thing is that half of currently accredited freelance interpreters are planning to retire in the next 5 years. So we're not, it's not just a question of, do we have enough interpreters for the 57 meetings in a week? It's a question of members asked about sustainability. We're facing a mass retirement event, and we need to have appropriate attention paid to that. Thank you.
So thank you for those comments, and thank you to all members and our witnesses for this important conversation. I think the points that were just raised are also really relevant because I'm understanding more and more the amount of work you do and for who all you're doing it. So it's not just the House of Commons, but it's also for Cabinet, it's also for departments. And I think you've helped me actually alleviate some of the information I had in my head, and you've actually countered it. And I think we actually need to understand more so the work you do and how you do it and who you do it for. So if you can provide us those details and actually differentiate between the conversation we're having for the House of Commons versus all of your other commitments, I think that would actually help better inform us as to where are the harms and where are the opportunities and how can we do what we're trying, well, have the conversation we're having. So thank you so much for your service. I hope you know how much I adore you people. And I really do try my best to make sure we
feel your love.
Are able to do your work, and all members will keep doing that. Keep well and safe. Thank you.
Before, Madam Chair, before you adjourn, I mean, you could let the witnesses go, but I have a housekeeping question for you and the clerk. I was just wondering, as we go into this constituency week, whether in order to just get a sense of what the calendar looks like moving forward, we could better understand the witnesses that we're going to be seeing, because we only know what we submitted, don't know how many witnesses we have overall for this study. We committed to a certain
So
number
last meeting, we determined that I would be sharing that with the subcommittee, and the clerk is actually just trying to compile that. So we actually took care of this last meeting.
Oh, sorry.
And
I didn't hear that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Excellent. Perfect. Have a great
Totally
day,
missed
everyone.
that.
Happy
No, no.
Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
you.